What role do hope and hopelessness play in Nietzsche's thought? It is easy to assume that the Nietzschean death of God dismantles the conditions in which theological hope may serve as a referent for philosophical reflection, but the situation is much more complicated than this. It requires us to locate hope and despair on three levels in his work. The first concerns the death of God itself. This death obliterates the object, source, and final aim of Christian hope, yet it seems thereby to reproduce the logic of hoping against hope while actually depriving this logic of its transcendent referent. Let us recall that this death is first announced in the gay science, and that it there marks a transition from despair to hope in Nietzsche's own struggle with his physical maladies. On the first page of the 87 preface, Nietzsche describes the project in these terms, quote, "The gay science. This signifies the saturnalia of a mind that has patiently resisted a terrible long pressure, patiently, severely, coldly, without yielding, but also without hope, and is now all of a sudden attacked by hope for health, by the intoxication of recovery. This entire book is really nothing but an amusement after a long privation and powerlessness, the jubilation of returning strength, of a reawakened faith, of reopened seas, of goals permitted and believed in again," end quote. Now, the image of the reopened seas appears again in the opening section of Book 5, where Nietzsche asserts that, quote, "the greatest recent event, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become a bit unbelievable, is already starting to cast its first shadow over Europe," end quote. In that context, Nietzsche predicts a long succession of demolition, that a long succession of demolition should follow closely on the heels of this announcement. Even still, the death of God means for him, quote, "that the sea, our sea, lies open again. Maybe there has never been such an open sea," end quote. What Nietzsche calls here the hope for health is one of the most immediate effects of the death of God. In its content and in its form, this hope stands at odds with its theological variants. On those few occasions when Nietzsche addresses theological hope, as he does in The Antichrist, he treats it as a holy lie. Here again I quote, "Strong hope is a much greater stimulus to life than any piece of individual happiness that actually falls our way. Suffering people need to be sustained by a hope that cannot be refuted by any reality, that is not removed by any fulfillment, a hope for a beyond," end quote. The Greeks, Nietzsche adds, were rightly suspicious of hope. Precisely because of this capacity to string unhappy people along, Nietzsche claims, the Greeks considered hope to be the evil of evils, the truly insidious evil. By contrast, the primary object of hope in the gay science is that following the death of God, humanity will be able to love the world as it is. So what Nietzsche calls amor fati, or the love of faith, the love of necessity, is not entirely devoid of the qualities we attribute to radical hope, or which Lear attributes to radical hope. Yet it is difficult to avoid seeing it as a way of reconciling oneself with what is irrevocable. The love of faith is thus sadness lived as joy, despair transformed into a hope. So the second manner in which Nietzsche approaches hope and despair is at the level at which the love of fate passes over into what he calls tragic wisdom. Now, tragic wisdom is a prominent theme in the later Nietzsche from 1887 on. One of its best articulations appears in Ecce Homo, where Nietzsche takes stock of his entire trajectory from the perspective opened by the birth of tragedy. There he tells us that tragic wisdom, or Dionysian wisdom, Dionysian philosophy, consists primarily in, quote, "the affirmation of passing away and destruction, saying yes to opposition and to war, becoming, along with a radical rejection of the very concept of being." Now, if the love of fate entails the affirmation of passing away, tragic wisdom goes a step further and calls for joy and destruction. The negative or no-saying element of Nietzsche's thought is lodged here at the level where Nietzsche is primarily concerned to show how tragic philosophy overcomes what he calls active and passive nihilism. In a notebook entry dated June 10th, 1887, Nietzsche attests that, quote, "the belief in the absolute immorality of nature, in aim and meaninglessness, is the psychologically necessary affect once the belief in God and an essentially moral order becomes untenable. Nihilism appears at that point because one has come to mistrust any meaning in suffering, indeed in existence," end quote. So nihilism, the belief that existence is in vain, is thus the effect, not the cause of the death of God. And it results in two different psychological affects. One, passive nihilism, refers to the paralysis that sets in after the moral interpretation of existence collapses, and it issues in the belief that one lacks the right to posit new values or a new meaning to experience. The other, active nihilism, refers to the will to self-destruction that takes hold among those, according to Nietzsche, who cannot fully accept the goallessness of existence. So active nihilism is a privileged form of despair for Nietzsche, what he calls hopeless despair. And it's extremely close to tragic wisdom. In fact, tragic wisdom emerges through the self-overcoming of active nihilism, that is, through the conversion of hopeless despair into the highest hope. It is impossible to ignore the fact that this conversion, which is nothing other than the revaluation of values in Nietzsche's work, is steeped in a lust for violence, one that justifies the means for the sake of the end. On the face of it, tragic philosophy for Nietzsche is really nothing other than the work of justifying destruction. In the June 10, 1887 passage, Nietzsche makes it clear that the tragic philosopher not only lets the will to destruction run its course in history, but helps it along by facilitating the destruction of culture after the death of God. The later Nietzsche's interest in discipline, in breeding, his love for warfare, his tendency to justify mass extermination for the sake of revaluation are all rooted in this impetus to live despair as a new kind of hope. Nietzsche's tragic philosophy thus demonstrates for us all too well the risks involved in assuming that the responsibility Lear associates with radical hope, namely the responsibility to become the spokesperson for the death of a way of life from within that way of life. So Nietzsche's tragic philosophy demonstrates the problems that are involved in assuming this kind of responsibility. So this latter paradigm, becoming the spokesperson for death, fits the tragic philosopher quite well, since Nietzsche sees in this philosopher humanity emerging from the chrysalis of morality. In terms of the critique of hope, tragic philosophy also illustrates that radical hope inevitably risks justifying violence by virtue of the fact that it binds itself to an unforeseeable future. Hope chooses between being responsible for the present and being responsible for the future. Perhaps it is impossible to usher in the future without somehow turning away from the present, neglecting it, refusing to respond to it, even to the point of letting it die. Nietzsche certainly thinks so. What he calls his great hope, or his highest hope, marks the apex of irresponsibility with regard to the present. This hope refers to the coming of the figure of the Übermensch, the overman, a being whose capacity for joy in passing away is so great that this joy redeems existence in its entirety. Now, the love of fate and tragic wisdom both represent efforts to live despair as hope. So this is the model that I'm concerned with, despair as hope, as opposed to another model that I'll get to in a moment. It's at this level that we see Nietzsche embracing the spectacle of catastrophe. Right? There is, however, a third level at which hope and despair converge in Nietzsche, and though at this level, the model that comes into view often serves the needs of what he calls Dionysian philosophy, I want to highlight the way in which, at this level, the convergence of hope and despair remains irreducible to this lust for violence. Now, the doctrine of eternal recurrence of the same famously stipulates that the universe is a tune that repeats itself endlessly, that everything that occurs has already occurred and will recur an infinite number of times. The doctrine atomizes time into a finite sequence of instants, each of which is effectively infinite since it recurs endlessly. Starting in late 1881, Nietzsche began describing the thought of eternal recurrence as the ultimate litmus test for affirming the world as it is. In The Gay Science, he argues that if one can embrace each and every instant as eternal, then one has essentially broken free from the moral interpretation of existence. The lesson imparted by Zarathustra, the figure of his central book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which he published over a series of years in the mid-1880s, is that all resentment, fundamentally, all resentment, as such, originates out of the hatred of time. Quote, "It was. Thus is called the will's gnashing of teeth and loneliest misery. Impotent against that which has been, it is an angry spectator of everything past. This, yes, this alone is revenge itself, the will's unwillingness toward time and times it was, end quote. So the doctrine of eternal recurrence for Nietzsche overcomes the spirit of revenge by restoring what the passing of time seems to rob from us. Here I quote, "Everything seems far too valuable to be fleeting. I seek an eternity for everything. Ought one to pour the most precious salves and wine into the sea? My consolation is that everything that has been is eternal. The sea will cast it up again," end quote. Now, the doctrine of eternal recurrence aims to alter how we relate to the instant, and it does so by redefining eternity. It replaces the classical view of eternity as the standing now, and with it the notion of finite time as a mere shadow presence, with the notion that the instant is constituted recursively, by which I mean there is an infinite series of copies of the instant. So the recursive structure of the instant, according to this doctrine, determines, in my reading, presence as an abyss. It also makes it possible for the impulse of hope to rise out of this abyss in order to affirm the instant as an instant of resurrection. And here I quote, "All joy wants the eternity of things, wants honey, wants resin, wants drunken midnights, wants graves, wants tomb tears solace, wants gilded sunsets," end quote. Now, the doctrine of eternal recurrence can thus be read as a kind of radical hope for the present. Radical hope in this instance is the impulse that treats the present as its own incomprehensible resurrection, as well as its own tragic sacrifice. So on my reading, there is no intrinsic connection between this notion of the present as constituted recursively and the Nietzschean theme of joy in destruction. It is in fact entirely possible that the lust for destruction leads Nietzsche to cover over the recursive structure of the instant in ways that convert, in his hands at least, the doctrine of eternal recurrence into a dogmatic metaphysics of the will to power. Now, the doctrine of eternal recurrence thus potentially provides a check on the love of fate and tragic wisdom as they seek to turn hope, despair into hope, or to live despair as hope. In their place, this doctrine thinks the presence of the instance as a mad hope for resurrection, as I've said. So it's on this level that I see Nietzsche as reproducing a vestige of the absurd logic of hope, or theological hope. And this reproduction of theological hope, I think, has an intriguing effect on 20th century European philosophy. I think it actually invites philosophers in Nietzsche's wake to take up theological hope and to recast it in secular forms.